The first thing that stuck out to me in Action Comics #1 is this first page for a contest, where the reader is encouraged to turn to a page, color it in, and then rip it out to send it in and get a whopping $1. So yeah, there are probably rare versions of this already famously rare comic out there. The actual story starts with one whole page explaining Superman's backstory, perfectly brief if you ask me, and some more interesting things here, like how they say he can leap 1/8 of a mile. Superman couldn't fly originally. That was introduced in the Fleischer cartoon to lessen the workload on the animators. The last panel provides a scientific explanation for his powers. Was always under the impression they didn't try to justify it at all, beyond just he's an alien, so this was interesting. The actual story opens on Superman ready for action with a woman in his arms, before going to see the governor. Superman explains that the woman he saved is to be electrocuted in 15 minutes and he needs a signed confession to save her. This leads to the now iconic trope of Superman being shot without getting harmed. After this, we move to the next plotline, with Clark Kent coming to work at the Daily Star, not the Daily Planet. A co-worker then informs Clark of a wife-beating occurring at 211 Court Avenue. I'm honestly surprised a wife-beating would be considered worth reporting on in 1938. Superman beats him in a righteous round of fisticuffs before the cops come to see Clark Kent with a collapsed wife-beater. Now, before we move on, I want to really defend the whole Clark Kent Superman disguise thing. First, wait, did they really spell it as though? Like THO? What was I talking about? Right, Clark goes out to dinner with Lois Lane before some other man tries to get with her. Lois deals with him correctly. The man does not take this well and chases after her in his car, leading to a kidnapping. If you know anything about this comic, you might actually know what happens next. Superman chases them down, raises the car over his head, and smashes it to bits. I'll be completely honest, I'm surprised this actually happens in the story. I always thought it was just an exciting front page they cooked up with no relation to anything. We then end off on a storyline where Superman scares the crap out of a lobbyist, which is pretty cool. Honestly, like this a lot more than I thought I would. Biggest complaint I have would probably be the text describing the stuff we're already very clearly seeing, which I've always felt was just an unnecessary holdover from novels which don't have visuals. Beyond that, it serves its purpose well as a story about Superman saving the day and doing the right thing. Also, shout out to how Superman only has red feet on the front cover. He has blue feet in every other page. And that is the end of the Superman story in Action Comics #1. There's still 52 pages left that we gotta get through. Our second story is a western starring a gunslinger named Chuck Dawson, a revenge story where Chuck decides to get revenge on the crooked cattleman who killed his father. He goes to the saloon and beats them with little resistance. In response, the crooks attempt to get a sneak attack on him. It doesn't end well. Honestly, not super interesting here, but I want to bring up that this cowboy named Chuck Dawson knows jujitsu. That's funny to me. Doesn't mean much though, since they take him out and take him to a jail cell, which he quickly breaks out of. This to be continued would be a lot more valuable if I cared. That sounded a bit too cynical for my liking, so allow me to elaborate on something that was valuable about Chuck Dawson. It taught me that the first Superman story has some value outside of being the first. There's been a history of people seeing comics as a children's medium, and although that stigma lasted long past Action Comics #1, it is interesting to see that the first Superman comic was actually better written than some stuff out at the time. The next story is Zatara, Master Magician, the title of which reminded me of Zatanna, which is not a coincidence. Zatara in the canon is the father of Zatanna, who ended up becoming a much more popular character. Worth mentioning that this comic is also Zatara's debut. We open on Zatara and his somewhat culturally dated sidekick Tong, discussing a string of railroad robberies expected to be the doing of his arch-nemesis, the Tigress. Using a crystal ball, they find the next train they're going to rob and report this news to Zatara's detective friend Brady. Just think it's really funny for a superhero to have a friend named Brady who betrays him by the second page shooting one of his buddies. We get to see Zatara's superpower of conjuring random crap whenever need be before Tigress appears from behind, pushing him off the train car. He lives! Unconvinced Brady would do something like this, Zatara finds this emblem on one of the train cars. Just want to bring up real quick how much I love these character designs. They tell you so much about the time this comic was made in. Tigress corners Zatara and puts together a trap, which I swear to you is only put into the story so he can escape out of it like a magician. After this, Zatara gets onto the train using the mark from earlier to trick the dastardly villains. Zatara gets cornered and says, "Screw the magic crap, I'm just gonna use this gun I got from a mobster earlier." After capturing the crooks in the boxcar, he fights Tigress. This happens, and Zatara wins while letting Tigress escape shaking her fist, and the day is saved. Kind of struggle to say much about this one. It's bog standard and might be kind of hurt from having the first goddamn Superman story before it, but it was interesting seeing more than one DC superhero debut in this issue though. Also interesting, the first Superman comic did not have a main villain, did not have like a named villain, but Zatara did, so there's a one-up that it has over Superman. Alright, next comic. What's going on here? Okay, so even though there are barely any pictures, this ended up being one of the more interesting stories. Too bad it was for the wrong reasons. We open on two characters in a boat exploring the tropics, Brett Coleman and his assistant Cotton Ball, who talks like this, and, I mean, you could have seen this coming thanks to the opening illustration, but this was the first story to elicit the same feelings as old Looney Tunes. There are tons of great Looney Tunes shorts, ones that are still as good today as they are the day they came out. There are also some that aren't. Anyway, the actual story isn't that interesting. Brett and Cotton Ball save a man from the ocean who warns of some natives that went mad and killed everyone. Yeah, I think we're done here with this one. Next up is Sticky Mitt Stimson, which is one I was actually looking forward to. It's just a simple 4-page gag strip with very little dialogue. I disliked how much unnecessary text that the previous comics had, so this one was a stark contrast. It doesn't have much story and it's about as complex as a Looney Tunes short. But it's a gag strip, it doesn't need more than that. Next up is my personal least favorite, The Adventures of Marco Polo. Taking place in the year 1271, Marco Polo set out on a journey where they go and it's pretty boring. Shoutouts to this panel of just text. Anyway, they set sail for Babylonia for treasures. They're attacked by a neighboring ship, which lasts a whopping 3 panels. Before they arrive in Babylonia to collect treasure in the cave, they get attacked and god damn it. Next up is thankfully a much better story, Pep Morgan, a story of a boxer. We open on a regular fight without much stakes outside of him being blinded briefly. This first page mainly exists to introduce the main villain. Not a boxer, but an unscrupulous manager named Doc Lowry. Morgan wins the first fight, and we're introduced to the next boxer, Bushman, and once again managed by Lowry. Pep and Bushman fight in the ring, which starts with Bushman blinding Pep's eye. Pep wins the fight, but shortly after reveals that Bushman had a hypodermic needle hidden in his glove. The comic ends with Doc Lowry being sentenced to prison. I like this story. It's simple, but the twist at the end gave me a shocking amount of enjoyment for a story this old. It kind of gave me a bit of an aha moment when the hero finally won, which the other stories didn't, which are just the other guy was stronger. Next up is Scoop Scanlon, a noir story with an art style I just adore. One of my favorite art style choices is Harsh Shadows, and Scoop Scanlon has that. It immediately reminded me of this Tic Tac commercial Richard Williams did in the 80s, which was probably inspired by comics like Scoop Scanlon. We open on Scoop and his partner Rusty trying to get coverage of a jewel thief landing at the docks. I've always seen noir as one of the cheesier genres, and this is noir in spades. Tommy guns, gang members, car chases. Honestly feels weird seeing a story like this where the outside world at the time it was written wasn't too different. I talked earlier about text explaining stuff that's already being shown, and this story is the worst offender. This entire page does not need any text, but despite that, every panel has a text box describing what's shown. The story ends with the police tracking down the thieves and the day is saved. The end. Our final comic is Tex Thompson, a story about a cowboy traveling the globe after having struck it rich on oil in Texas. We open on Tex in a small town in England, meeting with a neighbor named Robert who tags along with him as they walk around. Suddenly, they find a dead body. While Robert goes to find the police, Tex stays behind to look over the body, before a femme fatale walks on by with a sinister plot, finding the body and framing Tex for the murder. Almost as if the will of the universe itself is against Tex Thompson, the sheriff appears on the scene immediately believing the woman. Tex punches the sheriff and leaves, truly a master tactician. After escaping, Tex learns that the woman is a part of a gang who actually committed the murder and is attempting to frame Tex. They attempt to murder Robert, but Tex is hot on the gunman's tail. We cut back to the mobsters and find out that they plan to have the woman kill Tex by setting up a situation where she can kill him in self-defense. In the meantime, Robert is still running to tell the police, before he comes across a little girl named Betty, who he tells to warn the police so he can get back to the shack and help Tex. Robert creates a distraction by literally just announcing his existence on our mortal plane, which is enough for Tex to get a hit in. Tex unfortunately gets knocked out, only for the mobster to wait for Tex to wake up, so the mobster can tell Tex to run away? I thought we established the mobsters are not only okay with murder, but also cowardly. Why is he doing this? Betty successfully warns the police of the mobsters, and the day is saved. The end. This one was about as good as a single story from the Superman comic. Very simple, but kind of stretched thin since it's across like 10 pages. There is some funny dated stuff, like the mobster knocking Tex unconscious just so he can wait for him to wake up and tell him to leave, but overall it's a simple escapist fantasy comic. Then we have this page titled Odds and Ends. You may notice the scan quality here is a lot worse than the previous comics. This is because this is the page that readers were encouraged to color in, rip out, and send in for a prize. The actual comic itself isn't too interesting, just some baseball facts. And we end off on the iconic ad sections. If you know anything about retro comics, you'd know that these were rampant. Everyone knows about these, there's even a coffee table book collecting them, so I won't waste your time talking about this one. Especially since the resolution is too low for me to actually read the damn thing. And that is the end of the most famous comic book of all time. First off, I want to ask you something. Did you ever kind of forget we were talking about Action Comics #1 at any point? Because I kind of did. The more I read these stories, the more Superman kind of drifted into the background. I wasn't expecting there to be more than just Superman, which I'm happy about because I don't think this video would have been very interesting if it was just Superman. You know what? Let's rank all the stories. #1 favorite for me was, surprisingly, Pep Morgan. It was only 4 pages, but the villain having a trick up his sleeve that the reader could figure out made it a lot more engaging versus it just being a pure and simple test of strength. Second for me is Superman. A big reason for this is the historical significance. It is interesting to see what the core tenets of the character were in his first story, and there are Superman stories that still maintain the themes of him just being a guy who wants to do the right thing. Worth mentioning, the upcoming Superman Legacy is actually going to skip the backstory stuff and go straight into Superman, which, if Action Comics #1 is any indication, that is the way to go. Crazy how even the creators of these characters knew the backstories were the least interesting part. Third place, I'm putting in Sticky Mitt Stimson. Just a simple gag strip, but with so little dialogue and taking so little time to read, I'm feeling fairly forgiving towards it. Zatara is going in 4th, partially thanks to having more of a historical significance. If Zatara wasn't a character who still exists today, I'd probably place it lower, but since Zatara can be brought up in a conversation as a fun piece of trivia, it's getting 4th place. Chuck Dawson is going in 5th place. It's a fairly bland Western story, but it's short and doesn't stretch itself thin. It's also helped by being one of the earliest stories in the comic. Gonna put Scoop Scanlon here. I praise the art style, but outside of that, not much else to it. Really simple noir comic story. Remember when I said earlier that Chuck Dawson is a fairly bland Western story that doesn't stretch itself thin? Well, Tex Thompson is a fairly bland Western story that does stretch itself thin. I said it's about as good as a single story from the Superman comic, but despite that, it's 11 pages. 11! Superman is 15! When I summarized Tex Thompson earlier, I skipped over 2.5 pages because of how little happened in them. If it was around the same length as Chuck Dawson, it'd be a tie between the two. The Adventures of Marco Polo is just plain boring, so it's going on the bottom. And that ends the rankings. No, I will not be ranking South Sea Strategy. To answer the question of, is Action Comics #1 actually good, I'd say it's a mixed bag. The first ever Superman story is good for the same reasons most good Superman stories are, All-Star Superman being the most famous example. There are some diamonds in the rough here, like Pep Morgan, which isn't even the greatest story ever told or anything, it's just the only one that encouraged the reader to think a little. Less so diamonds in the rough, more so dollar bills between the couch cushions. As I'm writing this, I'm actually scrolling back up to the top of the script to add stories I forgot about to the rankings. Before we end off, I want to admit something that I've kind of ignored throughout this video, which is the title. Action Comics. These were always just meant to be fun action-adventure romps. A lot of these stories may be worse now than they were the day they came out, but if we're talking about narrative depth, these stories are about as deep now as they were when they first came out. These were always seen as simple stories, just fun escapism for people to get lost in. Am I missing its point by analyzing and reviewing it like I have been? I don't think so, but it is worth acknowledging that these weren't really meant to hold up to that much scrutiny. And hey, without this comic we probably wouldn't have 90% of superhero media, if not more, so make of that what you will.